First Chronicles 20. Normally we go through 1 Samuel first, or we'll parallel the two, but we'll go through 1 Chronicles first. It's a rather short chapter, just 8 verses. But we want to spend the majority of our time talking about 2 Samuel 11 and 12. So we're going to run through Chronicles rather quickly so we can hit in 2 Samuel in some greater detail. Next week, Donnie will be teaching the class out here. I'll be out of town, so Donnie will be teaching the class out here next week. If you didn't get questions for next week, we have them on the front, or you can see me after services. First, before we get into 1 Chronicles 20, as you're turning there, we'll review real quickly, as we do each week, our outline of the book. 2 Samuel, we've divided into 4 major sections. The first of those being David's reign over Judah in 1 to 4, and then his reign over all Israel in 5 to 10. Now, we said we divided it that way because a significant event that we're going to see tonight happens in chapter 11, and that's David's sin with Bathsheba. And really, 11 on through chapter 20 are some of the long-term consequences that result because of David's sin with Bathsheba. And then chapters 21 through 24 are going to be David's final years. We're also going through 1 Chronicles. We divided it into 2 sections. The first of those were genealogies in 1 to 9. But we're in the second section, the reign of David, 10 through 29. So we're in chapter 20. 1 Chronicles chapter 20. First 3 chapters is just a list of talking about some of David's victories. These victories are recorded near the end or in our accounts in Samuel as well. We're going to hit Chronicles' account of those for time's sake. In verse 1 it says, "Then it happened in the spring at the time when the kings go out to battle." It's the same time frame we're dealing with in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, because that's how 2 Samuel 11 starts. So we're talking about the same time frame. "That Joab led out the army and ravaged the lands of the sons of Ammon, and came and besieged Rabbah," which we see at the end of chapter 12. "But David stayed at Jerusalem, and Joab struck Rabbah and overthrew it. And David took the crown of their king from his head, and he found it to weigh a talent of gold, and there was a precious stone in it, and it was placed on David's head. And he brought out the spoil of the city, a very great amount. And he brought out the people who were in it, and cut them with saws, with sharp instruments, and with axes. And thus David did to all the cities of the sons of Ammon. Then David and all the people returned to Jerusalem." So David's out on the campaign here at the latter half of the story that we'll see again. It's mentioned in detail at the end of chapter 12, but we're going to hit it here for time's sake, in case we don't get all the way through chapter 12 to hit it there. Chapter 4, verses 4 through 8, deals with his victories over the Philistines and then some of the giants. "Now it came about after this," verse 4, "that war broke out at Gezer with the Philistines. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite killed Sippai, one of the descendants of the giants, and they were subdued. And there was a war with the Philistines again, and Elnathan the son of Jair killed Lama, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Again there was war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, and he also descended from the giants. When he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. These were the descendants from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." So there were still some of the giants left in the area, and here we see where they're killed. Elnathan the son of Jair killed Goliath's brother, and then down here they have this other giant that was killed by David's nephew Jonathan. It was the son of his brother Shimei. And so the descendants of the giants fell by the hand of David and by the hands of his servants in verse 8. But again, we really want to be hitting on and spending our time in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. There's a lot of material for us to cover in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. So we'll be turning there. It's where we'll spend the remainder of our time tonight. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is a chapter that we're very well familiar with, both 11 and 12, because of what takes place in this text. Because we remember David, as he is called and referred to by the Lord, as a man after God's own heart. And that's how we often remember David. And so an event like chapter 11, and what David does here in his sin with Bathsheba, is an event that stands out in the minds of us all. You know, this event in David's life that we're fixing to discuss would not stand out as much if David was an immoral man. We wouldn't think anything about this story if he was a man that was constantly in sin or constantly had disregard for God's law. And if you're reading through the story of Saul and a story like this appeared in the midst of the story of Saul, just as you see all these other things that Saul has done, it probably wouldn't shock you. It probably wouldn't be anything you think much about. But we think a lot about this text because of who committed the sin, and that it was David, a man after God's own heart. And so let's talk about this sin with Bathsheba, this event that stands out in the minds of us all. That's really, the sin itself is taking place here in the first 5 verses. Let's look at what's taking place here in 1 through 5. Then it happened in the spring, at the time when the kings go out to battle. Remember, that's how chapter 20 of First Chronicles started as well. That David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they destroyed the sons of Ammon and besieged Rabbah, but David stayed at Jerusalem. So this is the time when the kings go out to war, but at this point, David has not gone out. We know he does go out later on. It's mentioned in the latter half of 1 Chronicles 20, but at this point, David has stayed behind. And it says, now when evening came in verse 2, that David arose from his bed and walked around on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful in appearance. So David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is that not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? David sent messengers and took her, and when she came to him, he lay with her, and when she had purified herself from her uncleanness, she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David and said, I am pregnant. Let's talk about 1 through 5 real quick, what's taking place here. 1 through 5 is where we see this sin taking place. I think it's important we go back to the beginning of this before the sin ever takes place and understand something. David, at the moment that he's walking on his roof and he first caught a glimpse of her, I'm not talking about when he looked at her, when he first just saw her. If he had turned the other way, then things would have been a very different story. But David, when he caught a glimpse of her as he's walking on his roof, he doesn't turn away. Instead of just seeing her, he actually looks at her. And so, as he looks at her, he sees she is very beautiful in appearance, and then that's when he inquires of her. What do you think about a passage with me in the New Testament? Keep your finger here in 2 Samuel 11, but go look at the book of James chapter 1. In James chapter 1 and in verse 12. James 1, 12 to 15, I just have outlined in my Bible as the genealogy of sin. That's what's taking place in James 1, 12 through 15. I think when we look at James 1, 12 through 15 in this genealogy of sin, and we look at the story of David, we can see the parallels as to how this is taking place. So it says, beginning at verse 12, blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. Now, let's listen closely to 14 and 15. This is the key to this. But each one is tempted when he is carried away and enticed by his own lust. Then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully matured, it brings forth death. Now, when there's that lust, there's that pull to sin. Now, David has lusted in his heart and already sinned when he lusts after her in this text when he sees her and desires her. But I think we see what James is talking about bore out in this text. David sees her, and how does it describe her, what he saw? That she was what? She was beautiful in appearance. And so he sees she's beautiful in appearance. At this point, what has David done? I'm sorry? He inquired about her. But what part of our genealogy in James 1 has David already taken part of in verse 2? Lust. Now, when David inquires and calls for her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, now we have lust that has brought forth what? Sin. What's the result of sin? Death. So at the point when sin happens, in James chapter 1, when you go to Genesis, we know that physical death is a result because of sin. But James chapter 1 is dealing with the fact that when we sin, there is spiritual death. At the point that sin takes place, it brings forth death unless that sin is properly dealt with. So in the case of David here, we have him lusting in verse 2. We have him actually going to the sin itself. It was bad enough when it was in his mind. Now he's acting on it in verse 4, and we have the result of death. But I think too in this story, David probably never thought that anybody would ever catch him. And we'll see that later on in chapter 12. But David probably at this thought, he may have thought at this point he'd gotten away with it. And so she goes back. She's purified herself from her uncleanness. She returned to her house. And then she's conceived, and she sends and tells him that in verse 5. Now, David thinks maybe he's going to get away with it, but now he's got to realize he's not going to get away with it. Her husband's not even there right now. So, beginning in verse 6 and going through verse 13, we have where David and Uriah are together in Jerusalem, and where David calls for Uriah. Look at verse 6. So David sent to Joab, saying, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked concerning the welfare of Joab and the people of the state of the war. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah went out of the king's house, and a present from the king was sent out after him. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Now when they told David, saying, "Uriah did not go down to his house," David said to Uriah, "Have you not come from a journey? Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters, and my lord Joab and his servants of my lord, the servants of my lord, are camping in an open field. Shall I return to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? By your life and the life of your soul, I will not do this thing." Then David said to Uriah, "Stay here today also, and tomorrow I will let you go." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. Now David called him, and he ate and drank before him, and he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie in his bed with his lord's servants, but he did not go down to his house. So at this point in the story, David is called for Uriah. I think we forget something in this text about the story a lot of times. We talk about where David calls for Uriah, and David causes Uriah to get drunk, and David eventually has Uriah killed. But we often forget about the fact of Uriah here and his reaction as David calls for him and tells him, "You can go back to your wife." What's Uriah's reply? "I'm not going to do it." He says, the ark and Israel and Judah are in temporary shelters. He says that my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. So if they're off at war, and if all this is taking place, why should I, Uriah is saying, go back to my wife? I should be out there with them, is really where he thinks he should be. And so Uriah here is being a loyal servant to David and to Joab and saying, "I need to be out there with them. I'm not going back." So David says, "Stay today and we'll send you tomorrow." So he stays that day. And then what does David do in verse 13? He has him get drunk. He brings him in and he gives him food and drink and made him drunk. And then he sent him out to go back to his wife. David's thought process here probably was, if I get him drunk enough, surely he'll listen and go back to his wife. Where's Uriah found? With David's servants. And in the evening he went out on his bed with his Lord's servants. And he did not go out down to his house. So Uriah in both of these circumstances, when he was sober and when he was drunk, both stayed there with David's servants and was, had that mindset that I shouldn't go down and be with my wife and enjoy the comforts of my home while everybody else is out at war and while the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in temporary shelters. So David devises a plan, and in verse 13 through 27, or 14 through 27, we'll see that carried out. Now in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. He had written in the letter saying, "Place Uriah in the front line of the fiercest battle and withdraw from them so that he may be struck down and die." We'll talk in just a second about the rest of this. I just want you to think for a second. We just talked about what Uriah was like, how Uriah was being a loyal servant, how Uriah wouldn't go back to his own house. Can you imagine Uriah, the kind of person we've seen described for us in the verses previous, as David tells him to go back to the battlefield? Uriah is probably glad that David is sending him back, because that's where Uriah seems to feel he needs to be, is out there with the rest of the soldiers. And so David writes a letter and sends it by the hand of Uriah to Joab. And Uriah's probably thinking he's carrying a message and he'll get to be back out in the battle and he'll get to be with the other servants and other soldiers. And all along, he was carrying the very piece of paper that carried the message about having him killed. So Uriah carries back, if you will, his own death certificate back to Joab, because that's what's going to take place when he gets there. And so it was, verse 16 says, as Joab kept watch on the city, that he put Uriah at the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city went out and fought against Joab. And some of the people among David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. Then Joab sent and reported to David all the events of the war. He charged the messenger, saying, when you have finished telling all the events of the war to the king, and if it happens that the king's wrath rises and he says to you, why did you go so near to the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman throw an upper millstone on him from the wall so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Verse 22, so the messenger departed and came and reported to David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men prevailed against us and came out against us in the field, and we pressed them as far as the entrance of the gate. Moreover, the archers shot at your servants down from the wall, so some of the king's servants are dead. Now let's stop there for just a second. When Joab gave the message to this servant to take it to David, he told him, when you get to that point where you tell him his servants have died and they were shot down from the archers at the wall, what could be David's response? How did Joab perceive David would respond? In anger. Why did you go so close to the wall? You know, that was not a very good military strategy to approach the wall so close. Did you not know they would shoot you down? And so that's where Joab said, and one of the saddest statements to me recorded in Scripture is Joab tells the servant that when you get to that point in his anger, tell him Uriah is dead also. Yes.
You know, I'm thinking, this is premeditated stuff.
Mm-hmm.
David knew all about this in the fall. He knew what was going to happen. So he decided, he's going to just go ahead and have him killed.
Yeah, he determined he was going to have him sent out and killed in the battle. And, I don't know why David thought he could get away with it. We'll talk some about that when we get to practical lessons later on. I do think I can tell you why David probably thought he could get away with it, because he seemed to have gotten away with everything else so far. But, yeah, and to me that's a sad statement when you think about that, what Joab tells the servant. So the servant comes and he's told David the message. Now let's read the end of the message. So he's just told him the archers shot at the servant, some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is also dead. He comes and he gives him this instruction. All these people have died, but Uriah is also dead. Then David said to the messenger, verse 25, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this thing displease you, for the sword devours one as well as the other. Make your battle against the city stronger and overthrow it, and so encourage him. If it wasn't for the death of Uriah, David would have been angry with the way that the battle had unfolded, that they had approached the wall so closely, that they had been shot down. And when he hears that message that Uriah is dead, instead of being angry with Joab, instead of being angry about the way that the battle went, what does David tell the servant to do? Go back and encourage him. And one sword, the sword devours one as well as the other. Just make your battle, just make it strong. Your battle against the city stronger tomorrow and overthrow it. And that reaction there by David, I think, tells us all we need to know about how far David has come from the man that we've known so well through the stories we've seen so far to where he is at this point in his life as he's in this sin that is undealt with, is the fact that when he hears that, he's going to give a message of encouragement because what David wanted had happened. And Uriah had died. So now when the wife of Uriah heard, verse 26, that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. when the time of mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife. Then she bore him a son. But the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. And it's an important phrase we need to focus on in verse 27. We know that this was evil in the sight of the Lord. But I think it's important that when it's brought out here at the end of verse 27 about what he has done is evil in the sight of the Lord. Because here's this man that we often talk about as this great character of faith. And he is, because as we'll see in chapter 12, the reason we still remember him as a great character of faith is because of how he handles the rebuke that Nathan's going to bring to him. But this man we remember as this great character of faith, this man that we've talked about week after week as we've gone through this, all the way back into 1 Samuel when he's on the run and somebody's in trouble, he inquires of God. When his wives are taken captive, when all the people are taken captive that were there in the city, he inquires of God. When he becomes king and something's happening, he inquires of God. To the man that now has had a man murdered to cover up a sin that he had committed. I think it shows us how far sin can take somebody. There's people talk about how sin will take you farther than you wanted to go and keep you longer than you wanted to stay. I don't think David ever imagined that it would get to the point that it's gotten with David. David probably thought that he would call for Bathsheba, he would go into her, he would send her back, nothing would happen, that would be the end of it. Nobody would be the wiser. And then she ends up pregnant. And then he calls for Uriah, and Uriah won't go back to her. And then he has Uriah get drunk, and Uriah still won't go back. And so then he has Uriah killed. And that just shows us how far David has come and how far sin can take somebody, even somebody as great a man of faith as David. The fact that it took David so far in this text. But that brings us to chapter 12. And here we're going to have in the first 14 and a half verses where David's going to be rebuked by Nathan. Then Nathan sent to David, verse 1, and he came to him and said, there were 2 men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a great many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb, which he bought and nourished, and it grew up together with him and his children. It would eat of his bread and drink of his cup and lie in his bosom, and was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take from his own flock or his own herd to prepare for the wayfarer who had come to him. Rather, he took of the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger burned greatly against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, surely the man who has done this deserves to die. He must make restitution for the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and had no compassion. What's Nathan telling him in this story? What's Nathan trying to get David to see here? Himself. And I learned in this that sometimes it's hard for people to see themselves, the fault in themselves, and make application of something to themselves, because David didn't see it, but we'll talk more about that later. But, Nathan comes to him and just tells him this story here about this man that's got this vast flock. And here's this man that's got one little ewe lamb. And here the stranger comes to visit the man with the vast flock, and instead of taking from his own flock, he takes this man over here's one little ewe lamb and has it killed to serve to his visitor. Now, I want us to focus on something real quick in verse 6. We'll talk about the rest of this rebuke and David's response in a second. In verse 6, David said he must take restitution or make restitution. He must make, not take, restitution for the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and had no compassion. So this is one of those things. There are a lot of things in this story we don't know for sure, but I think there's a possibility, and I say there might be a possibility, that when David talks about he restores fourfold, that David himself restores fourfold. We can't be 100% certain that this being the exact case, but I want you to think about something with me for just a moment. David has said that the man shall restore fourfold for the life he took of this one little ewe lamb. David has taken the life of Uriah the Hittite. David in his lifetime, and again, this is why I say that this could be a possibility, not something we can be 100% certain about, that David could have been, that he restored fourfold, in that he actually lost 3 in his lifetime and a 4th one shortly after his death. But the 4th son was rebelling at the time of his death, and he ordered, and Solomon executed him when he took the throne. But I want you to think about something with me for just a second. We'll see this one in a second. The child that was conceived in this relationship dies in verse 18. The 7 days came to pass that the child died, 2 Samuel 12 and in verse 18. Next week, when you get into chapter 13, there's a story of Amnon and Tamar, where Amnon rapes his sister Tamar, and Absalom becomes angered, and Absalom kills Amnon in chapter 13 and in verse 33, because the news came to David that all his sons had been killed, but he was told it was only Amnon that is dead in verse 33. Then we have Absalom, who killed Amnon, who runs away. He comes back, but then rebels against David. We'll be over that next week and into the next week, where Absalom's rebelling against David. And in chapter 18 and in verse 14, Joab kills him. He said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. In 18 and in verse 14. And then finally, we have Adonijah in 1 Kings 2, 24 and 25, who is killed and struck down for his rebellion because he tried to seize the throne, even though the throne was promised to Solomon. So again, we can't be 100% certain that such is the case, but there does seem to be some connection that there's fourfold. David says the man will restore fourfold, and David does lose 4 sons. So it could be that this is actually, we know that some of the stuff that takes about is some long-term consequences for David's sin, because David's life is never the same after this. David had peace from his enemies and all this, and instead of having peace from his enemies, he's running from his own son. He's got problems with his own children. So it could be that this is actually him restoring fourfold, just as he had said, being some of the long-term ramifications and consequences that result from David's sin with Bathsheba. So I do think that's an interesting point to bring out. Again, we can't be 100% certain about that, but there does seem that there could be some connection there. Let's get back to our text. So Nathan has come to David so far and told this story, and David, after he's heard this story, said, the man shall restore fourfold. Now let's look at verse 7. Nathan then said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord God of Israel, it is I who anointed you king over Israel, and it is I who delivered you from the hand of Saul. I also gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your care, and I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added to you many more things like these. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in the sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the sons of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, verse 11, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. So there he talks about how he would raise up one from his own household. Absalom's going to rebel against him from his own household. He's told in verse 10 the sword would never depart from his house. So you think about it, as we talked about already. We'll stop there. We'll pick up in verse 12 in a second. David has been guilty of sin, and his life is fixing to change forever. In fact, in verse 12, indeed, you did it secretly, talking about the latter half of that I will, even his wives would be taken by his companion and be in broad daylight. And that's where Ahithophel, that we remember we mentioned Ahithophel Sunday morning in Psalm 55, that he's the traitor. Ahithophel tells Absalom, David's son that's rebelling, to go into David's concubines in chapter 16. So that's the latter half of that verse. And so you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and under the sun. And so again, that takes place later on in 2 Samuel 16, 21 and 22, where Ahithophel tells Absalom that. So we see this taking part. Absalom comes in rebellion. Absalom takes and lives with David's concubines. And it was not done in secret like what David had done. But I want you to notice verse 13. We talk about Saul and we talk about David, and what makes them different? at this point, let's just stop and think about it from how we often think about things, where we sort of put things on. We view things as there's these things that are really, really bad and these things that are not quite as bad. And if we would put at this point what Saul has done on one side, and when we followed his life, and what David has done in these 2 chapters alone, and we try and balance it out, Saul offered an unauthorized sacrifice, but David was guilty of adultery. Saul didn't follow the command of God by not destroying all of the people, the Amalekites, but David had an innocent man killed. And David lied to cover it up. And David had a man get drunk. You see, when you start weighing out these things, you would think from just the human standpoint, as we think of things, that what David has done is far worse than anything, from our standpoint, than anything Saul had done. But verse 13 is the key. Why is David a man after God's own heart and the kingdom taken from Saul? David said, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord has taken away your sin, you shall not die. So you think about this for just a second. Saul had said at times he had sinned, but Saul says, I have sinned, and Saul turns around and does what? He gives excuses and continues on doing all these same things. I have sinned because they told me we should offer it as a sacrifice. Or I have sinned, and then he gives some excuse. But here David says, I have sinned against the Lord. Not only does David acknowledge he sinned, he acknowledged who the sin is against. We could make the point here that David's sin involved a lot of people in it. Bathsheba was involved. The servants that retrieved her and helped cover it up. He had sinned against Uriah by taking Uriah's wife, by having Uriah killed. Joab had been involved and followed the orders. But in all this, when we look at this text, David acknowledges 2 things. One is that the sin was against God, and 2, he acknowledges his sin, not the part that anybody else played in it. David could have, in this text, said, I have sinned, but so did the servants that listened and went and got her for me. And so did Bathsheba because she didn't say no. And so did Joab because he listened to my instructions and had Uriah killed. And so did Uriah because when I put all that before him, he didn't have to drink till he was drunk. But David acknowledges his sin, and it was towards God, and does not make excuses. That's what separates David from Saul. It's not that David didn't sin and Saul did. It's how David reacted to his sins. And so it's acknowledged that the Lord has taken away his sin, and you shall not die in verse 13. But I think there's something about sin we often forget. You may have heard this story before. There was a farmer that told his son, every time you sin, every time you do something you shouldn't, you have to go out to the barn and drive a nail in the wall of the barn. And when you repent of that, you can take the nail out. And so whenever the son would do something wrong, he would go put the nail in the barn, and then he would take the nail away when he repented. One day he told his dad, he said, Dad, I noticed something. Even when you remove the nail, the hole is still there. Well, that's what's taking place here with David. David has acknowledged his sin. David is forgiven at this point of his sin. It's not that God doesn't forgive David. He forgives him. He says it was taken away from him in verse 13. But there were still some long-lasting consequences because of David's sin. Look at verse 14. Because by this deed you have given occasion of the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, this child also that is born to you shall surely die. So Nathan went to his house. That's just one of the consequences. Everything Nathan said before about the consequences about David's sin, how the sword would never depart from his house, how one from his own household would rebel, how one would take his wife and lie with him in daylight, what David had done secretly would be done against him publicly. Those things all still take place. Those are all long-term consequences that result of David's sin. But Nathan points out to David that just because you're forgiven of this doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen. This child will die. But I want us to notice a phrase at the first half of verse 14. Depending on your translation, it may say, you've given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. Or it may say that you have utterly scorned the Lord. Some translations say, the English Standard Version would say that in that text. But in verse 15, the New American Standard and the New King James will talk about how you've given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. That seems to be fitting there in the text better, and it's fitting with things we know from other scriptures as well that talk about our sin. But I think there's something we forget in our sin. We've talked about this with Saul. We often talk about how sin affects me and me alone, and sometimes sin has longer reaching impacts than just one. A lot of people lost their lives today that Saul lost his in battle, including Jonathan, his son, and that was a result because of what Saul had done. The sin of Saul had far-reaching consequences. So does the sin of David. He's going to lose the life of this child. But not only that, by having Uriah killed, he lost many servants that day on the battlefield beside Uriah the Hittite. But you know, he's given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. And when you think about that for just a second, what that means is that what we do when we are Christians, and we're saying, well, here we are as Christians practicing New Testament Christianity, and then we do something sinful, then those that are outside looking in can look at it, and it's kind of like was pointed out here, we've given occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme. They look at it and it's, well, you're saying that I need to change because, I need to be baptized because it says over here I need to be baptized, and I need to do this because it says over here I need to do that. But I happen to know somebody that goes to a Church of Christ that they do practice this over here. Or I know they claim to be living as they should, but they're over here, and he's on his third wife, and none of them, and he didn't have a right to divorce the first one, according to what you're telling me. You know, and there's all these things where people are looking at it. Or maybe you've heard that all members of the church, this statement you may have heard before, all members of the church are hypocrites. You may have heard that before, where people accuse them of all of hypocrisy. Well, the fact is, though that's not true, by the way that we live our lives, we can paint that picture if we're not careful. That is, we're sitting here telling somebody to follow God's will, and then we go out and we do something contrary to God's will, then how are we going to teach somebody that is lost? And in this case here, here's David, who's a servant of God. Here's David, who has been victorious time and time again because he's been a servant of God. And here are his enemies out there. And now you look at it, and here's this man, David, who's supposed to be this great, strong man and servant of God. And he's in an adulterous relationship, and he just had somebody, or he was just guilty of adultery, and he just had somebody killed. And you think about that for just a second. And how would you react if you were the Gentile world? How would you react if you were those that weren't of the Jewish people and you saw that taking place? What would be your thought? You know, I think we would react as, what makes them better than us? They're guilty of what we are. And so we've got to be careful that we do God's will, because we'll give an account, but we also need to be careful because we may, as David did in this text, give occasion for the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme when they look at us and see that here's what we're saying, but here's what we're practicing, and we're not living as we claim to be living. Yes.
You know, I think just looking at this picture here,
Yes.
in the long run, because people see what we do, and we try to do everything right. Sometimes we fail.
Right. And then there's those long-term impacts like David had, or maybe we paint a picture to somebody and it makes it harder to reach somebody in the long run. Let's look real quick. We'll hit through the rest of this rather quickly so we can get to practical lessons. Here we have the death of David's son. It's told him the child would die. He inquires of God for the child in verse 16. By the way, notice this, even though we talk about how David's life has changed from this point forward, David was guilty of sin. David has repented of that, and we turn right back around, and where do we find David? We find him praying and inquiring of God again. We find him where we would find him prior to his sin, as he has dealt with that sin. But he's praying and inquiring that the child would not die, and then as he's there, he is not eating or drinking anything, and it says that on the seventh day in verse 18, the child died. And the servants were afraid to tell David because they thought, well, listen, if he's over there fasting and mourning like this right now, how is he going to react when he finds out the child has actually died? David can see them, whispering and talking, and he asked, if the child had died. They told him yes. And he got up, washed and anointed himself in verse 20, changed his clothes, came into the house of the Lord and worshipped. And he came to his own house, and when he had requested, they set food before him, and he ate. And here his servants are just puzzled. Why is it while the child was living you wept? Now the child has died, you've gone and you've washed and you've eaten and all of this. I love David's reply down in verse 22. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me that the child may live. But now he has died, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me. And and in verse 22, as he's standing there, and he's making the point, listen, as long as that child was alive, he could pray to God that the Lord would spare the life of that child. But now the child has passed on, there's nothing David can do. And all he can do is be able to go to the child someday. Which, by the way, we learn in verse 23, I think we notice in verse 23, as subtle as it may seem, that those that are children that have not reached the age of accountability, because when Paul's talking in Romans 7 and he talks about this age of accountability, he's dealing with under the old law. The principle applies under the new law, but he's dealing with his relationship to the old law, that he didn't know the commandment, but when the commandment came, sin revived and he died. He quotes from the old law. So in Romans 7, Paul's saying, there was a time I didn't know, but then there came a time I knew, and then I died spiritually. So this child is young. So David understands here that he can't bring the child back, but he can go to the child. That tells me that one that dies before the age of accountability goes to the same place as those who have served faithfully. He can go to the child. And so we learn that in verse 23 as well. 24 and 25, he comforts his wife Bathsheba and goes into her, and she conceived a son, and they named him Solomon. Verses 24 and 25. And then 26 through the end of the text, David captures Rabbah, which we saw already in 1 Chronicles 20. It's recorded in a little bit more detail here, but we'll move on to practical lessons for time's sake, since we've already looked at that in 1 Chronicles. Let's talk about some practical lessons. We got about 3 minutes remaining. What are some practical lessons we see in these 3 chapters, but in particularly these last 2 we've dealt with in some detail? Right, God knows and sees everything. I mentioned earlier, David probably thought he could have got away with it, that nobody would have been the wiser. God still would have known. But David would have thought that from the human standpoint, nobody would have known, and that's how we often view it today. As long as I don't get caught by another person, then nobody knows.
The idea of sin takes you further than you're ever going to go.
Right.
You think the process of what happened when David committed that sin of adultery, that act of adultery was against the law and was requiring of his death. So in order to save his life, he had to require more or less Uriah's life. Otherwise, he was going to become exposed. And there's things that he just, in that moment in time, he didn't really think about.
Right.
You see the progression of why he did this, not just for one second, it's about Deuteronomy, that law was part of his heart. Things he didn't think about in that moment of lust. And that's not what, but that's where it took him.
Absolutely. I think when you get into next week's story and you notice what Amnon does to Tamar, Amnon should have been put to death for what he did. But it's very hard for David to order for Amnon to be put to death, because David should have been put to death himself, which I think ultimately would lead to Absalom killing him, which then leads to Absalom's rebellion later on, which I think was some ill will towards his father, partially for the fact that David didn't handle the Amnon situation like he probably should have. But then again, David really couldn't, because he would be hypocritical if he required Amnon's life from him, which is again why we see these long-term consequences bore out in these things that are taking place. Point out here that sometimes we don't see our own faults. David didn't. Nathan had to look right at him and say, David, you are the man. He didn't see it in the story himself. And sometimes what we need, and that brings us to the next one, the need for firm rebuke. Sometimes we may hear a story and have an application. We think of that, and that's a good lesson. Or we listen to something and think, that's a good point brought out there. But then we don't see ourselves and our own faults in that. And sometimes we need somebody like Nathan to look us right in the eyes and say, listen, you are the man. Sin can have consequences even when repented of. I think that's an important one for us to remember. Just because we repent doesn't mean consequences cease. I think that's how sometimes we view it. Why are these things happening years down the road? I've known people, by the way, that when they were younger had smoked, that died of lung cancer and hadn't smoked in 30 years. But there were consequences bore out years later. They had not done that in years. What's happening is some long-term consequences to things done many years earlier. And sometimes we see ramifications of something years down the road we never thought we'd see. But that can be a result of sin. Our actions can hinder the Lord's work. We saw that with the blasphemy. And death brings an end. David knew he couldn't pray anymore for the child. Death brought an end of any hope of that.